Well, as we continue our discussion on this great victory to protect the unborn, no one should be surprised, really, at the reaction from the left. In addition to the lawsuit from the Attorney General of the state of Washington, Democrats in Congress itself said that the FDA should literally ignore the ruling of the court. And possibly that's a decision that the Biden administration is not going to rule out. At least according to Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra, that's what he's saying. Well, joining me now in the studio to unpack all of this and what it means and where things might head from here is Dr. Chris Gacek. He's a senior fellow here at the Family Research Council. Chris, welcome back to the program. Thanks for joining me.
Good to be with you. I don't think we've ever been on the show together, so.
Yeah, so it was a first for almost everything. So glad to have you. All right, so walk us through what happened this past Friday on this court ruling.
This was in the history of the pro-life movement, I think, other than like the Dobbs decision, this was a big day because for 20 years, I mean, over 20 years, there have been phenomenal doctors, pro-life doctors, laboring away, arguing that this drug was safe, the regimen is unsafe, and that they had been documenting it and telling the FDA about it, and that the FDA was ignoring them. And so eventually, this is what happened. The litigation came about after almost 20 years. The first page of the opinion by the judge details basically that I've never seen anything like it. He says that why did this take all these years to come about? Because that was a question people having. Like, I thought this was approved like by Clinton, and he said because they stonewalled for 6,000 days.
Right.
And it's almost so reassuring to have somebody who comes along and says, you don't get to do this, to the FDA, right? And these big agencies that just think they can, abuse you and kind of, mistreat the process and just get away with everything. And you finally have a judge who actually sort of is looking at the rules and says, well, I'm going to make you actually sort of, stick with these things. Now, about the Washington case, what's kind of amazing is at the same time that this litigation was going on, you have a bunch of kind of radical leftists. I think it's about 10 or 11 states. They're not all from like the West. They're like Maryland is one of them, Maine, Pennsylvania. They're suing, and they were granted some kind of an injunction so that FDA has to keep the radical rules that it does have in place. In fact, they're sort of not happy because the rules aren't radical enough, and that Biden left a few in place, so they want to get rid of those. So you have this sort of this competing agenda. I think that that whole litigation came about as a kind of a counterweight to this one, in case, sort of like an insurance policy. If we lose in Texas, we've got this thing going, right? So we can kind of muddy the water and kind of balance things out. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's sort of the legal strategy here.
Yeah, and it almost seemed like they were expecting our side to win this to some extent, but what really is another layer to this whole thing is how the left at this point is literally pressuring the Biden administration to simply ignore the ruling and just go on as though it never happened.
I just want to make a comment about one of the people doing this. It was Ron Wyden, who was in the Senate, right? Ron Wyden, if you go back to basically 1993, 94, was politically putting a heavy hand on the FDA and the Clinton administration to push the drug through the approval process. Not only in like 94, when they were trying to transfer the rights to the drug from this French-German consortium over to some American company or to the federal government, he was pushing this, threatening to hold hearings. Then he did the same thing in 2000 when the FDA got to sort of the final, they're in the final furlong of the race, right? And they realized that they've got a dog here in this drug company that they've picked. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. And then this ton of political pressure was brought to bear on the FDA, and they caved in. And that the judge in pages, I'm just going to mention something, pages 54 to 56 of his opinion, he talks about this. And it seems one of the things about this opinion that shows you how that this judge is really good is that he sort of picked this out. And he was able to discern that in 2000 there was this pressure campaign and that the FDA realized that the drug was not safe. And he sort of draws all this in and says, you know, you did all this sort of violations of your rules. You were mentioning this before about it, you know, pregnancy is a disease and all this. They did this because they had to sort of glom onto some way to have some rules to kind of restrict the application of the drug, because they realized the people, you know, pushing the drug, the sellers of the drug, aren't going to do it. So we have to have some kind of control over them. And then what ended up happening was the political pressure forced them to sort of cave in, and now they've got this sort of hodgepodge of regulations. And the judge is kind of like kicking the can over, right? And I think that's where we are. We're going to maybe find out what actually happened in 2000. I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping that that's what we find out. But that's what he was saying. This doesn't make any sense.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see where this goes. I mean, there's no question the pressure is enormous.
Yes.
And
on the Fifth Circuit and on the Supreme Court.
Yeah. And what they're going to experience is tremendous pressure. And then you've got the Biden administration being pressured to ignore a ruling, which in itself, what in the world happens legally into the rule of law if you have the White House itself ignoring a high court decision? I mean, this whole thing is going to be not only interesting, but alarming to watch where it all goes. But I want to hit on something else that was mentioned with Nathan Watts here a few moments ago briefly, but you really understand this perhaps more than anyone I know, and that is the overshadowing all of this is just how dangerous these drugs are. While the left is trying to tell us that they're safe, that it's okay, that this drug's been out there a long time, that it's FDA approved, the reality, the science says otherwise.
Well, here's the thing that's interesting. So just last, 2 Fridays ago, April 1st, the New York Times published an article, and it was this big, it was basically an attempt to, if you go online, you look at the thing on your desktop, and it's got more bells and whistles, and it fizzles around, and it does all this sort of graphics and all this it's the craziest thing I've ever seen in my life. But it's like a magic show. So they say that there's nothing. Basically they say that all the other problems, everything, there's no big problem. But the key sentence is that 1 in 20 to 1 in 33 women will need to have a second surgical procedure because the first one failed due to retained products of conception or ongoing pregnancy. That's 1 in 20 to 1 in 33. So, I mean, think of any product where you would, any drug product where it would fail and you would have to have a second surgery to, and it's not some minor thing. This is, like a DNC. So it really does show that when you get underneath and you start looking at how this drug really operates, what the doctors were saying in 1995 and 2000, and these good doctors, they were right all along.
Well, it's going to be incredible to just keep a pulse. And Chris Gacek, I want to thank you for joining me on Washington Watch. We're keeping such a close pulse on this entire issue.
Thank you so much.
We've got a lot of work to do. Absolutely.